Hamadakyapi, Nick Tilsen, Amachiapi, Chantel, Washtenape, Chuzapalo. My name's Nick Tilsen, and I greet you with a warm, heartfelt handshake in my Lakota language. This is LANDBACK for the People. And in this coming show, we're going to bring some filmmakers, some storytellers, some journalists who have just completed a movie called Sugarcane. It's about the residential schools in north of the Medicine Line in Canada. It is about the journey of uncovering the graves and what happened to the Indigenous people as a result of these residential schools. It's a story about the intergenerational trauma that has caused and its relationship to the colonization of Indigenous people in North America. And we have, on this episode, we have Julian Brave Noisecat, and we have Emily Kassie. We wanted to bring them on the show. We wanted to have the conversation about residential schools and its relationship to LANDBACK. And, you know, throughout the history of Indigenous people, we talk about LANDBACK, not just the land itself, but what happened in the period of time that the land was stolen. What happened and what was done to our people through the process of colonization. And boarding schools and education were weaponized. That was one of the primary weapons that they used in order to assimilate Indigenous people into mainstream society and to destroy the familial structure of our tribes and our nation. And Sugarcane movie, it goes on a journey, and it takes you on a very personal journey in telling that story. And it was moving of how directly connected the historical colonization of our people is to the struggles that we are dealing with right now here today. The direct correlation between the stealing of Indigenous people from their mothers, their fathers, their grandmothers, to the fact that Native American youth and Indigenous youth in North America are committing suicide at higher rates than almost any other group. And this is compounded trauma. It's compounded struggle. And we're going to talk about that. Because when we have talked about LANDBACK, we've talked about it's not just about the physical land. It's about everything that they took from our people in the process of taking the land. And that all of that has had a detrimental impact on our communities and our people. And I think this episode in particular, I'm really, really asking our allies, our accomplices, to share this episode with your families, to share this episode with your communities, because it's important that you understand what has happened historically to our people, and it's important that you understand the trauma that still exists and how that has a direct correlation to the challenges that we face. And these two storytellers that put this movie together are award-winning journalists. They're writers, storytellers, creatives. Their stuff has been in Netflix, it's been in New York Times, it's been in PBS, and now we get to have them right here on LANDBACK for the People. Here we are, LANDBACK for the People. Special guest on today's show. We got Julian Brave Noisecat, storyteller, artist, journalist, political strategist, student of his art and culture, coming from his homelands. Give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, and then after that, we'll go to Emily Kassie, who is an award-winning cinematographer and filmmaker and producer, and is glad to have both of you on the show today. So we'll start off with you, Julian.
Wait, up Julian Brave Noisecat when Chechua sa kochmoch ken el statlam ken dat esken which dekwen. Hello everyone. I think Hamatakiapi, I think is how you guys say it around here. Julian Brave Noisecat Amachiapi. My name is Julian Brave Noisecat. I'm Sequetmoch and Statliunk, two nations that come from what is now British Columbia, Canada. My family primarily resides on the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve, although I have lots of relatives all over the interior, many from Mount Currie as well. And it's good to be here today in Rapid City, Mini Luzahan, I believe, in South Dakota. We have a screening later on today. We've been on what's called our Res Tour for our documentary Sugarcane, Emily and I and our crew, Jade Begay, Amber Morningstar Byers, and Angelo Ruiz. It's been such an honor to bring the film to the Prairie Knights Casino, to Eagle Butte, and now here to Rapid.
Welcome to the homelands.
I'm Emily Kassie. I'm the other director of Sugarcane, as well as a producer and cinematographer. My background is in investigative journalism and in documentary filmmaking, and I've kind of told stories around the world about folks who are at the crosshairs of conflict and atrocity. And this film has been, just an incredible journey and collaboration with Jules and with the rest of our team. And it's really awesome to be here today. Last night we got to go out and drive around the Badlands a bit, and it's just been an incredible experience getting to bring the film to Indigenous communities to whom the story belongs.
Well, we're happy to have you here, and people are excited to see the film and to engage in conversation and dialogue about it. Can we talk a little bit just about the journey? Like how did this project come to be? How did you both come to be in working on this project together?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I've been covering these stories in Afghanistan and West Africa about human rights abuses and conflict. I myself grew up in a community with a lot of Holocaust survivors and their descendants. And so I was really drawn towards stories of persecuted peoples and folks who had to face incredible adversity and yet had survived. And I hadn't turned my lens, though, on my own country and the atrocities that it committed against the First Peoples there. And that was Canada. I was born and raised in Toronto, and the last year of residential schools was my first year of kindergarten. And so when the news broke of potential unmarked graves on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, I felt gut pulled to the story. And the first thing that I did was text Julian. Jules and I worked our first reporting jobs together almost a decade ago. We were randomly sat at the desks next to each other and became fast friends. And of course, since then, Julian has gone on to become an incredible writer, storyteller, and historian of Indigenous life in North America. And it just felt like we could bring our skill sets together and do something really special here. And so I texted Jules and he said, let me think about it. I'll get back to you. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search. And I found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willi Sellers in the Williams Lake First Nation. And I sent him a cold email that day. He called me back that same afternoon and he said, the creator has always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document this search. So I spoke to council, I got my gear together, I booked flights, and 2 weeks later, I heard back from Julian.
And when I finally called Em back, I told her, hey, I think I'm open to collaborating with you on that documentary. And she said, great. I've identified a First Nation that's leading a search, and that search is happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. And for a minute there, I couldn't believe what I heard. And then I said, wow, that's really crazy. Did you know that's the school that my family was taken away to and where my father was born? So out of 139 Indian residential schools across Canada, Em happened to choose the one school that my family was taken away to and where my father's life began without even knowing it.
That's incredible. I mean, I think I don't believe in accidents, and I think that all of this work and all of that has happened like over this past few years is spiritually guided, and I think clearly this this partnership was meant to be, and this story was meant to be told. For the audience, talk a little bit about the film. Like, what is this film really about, and what are some of the big takeaways without being the spoiler?
So Sugarcane follows an investigation into abuse and missing children at the Indian residential school that my family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia. It was called St. Joseph's Mission. And it really follows what that investigation causes in the lives of 4 main characters from the surrounding Secwepemc community. So, as this investigation is unfolding, we follow the chief of the community, Willi Sellers, and his family as he tries to, both lead his people and also be a good dad amidst this moment of reckoning that fundamentally is about what happened to prior generations of Indigenous children and the ramifications of that today. We follow my auntie Charlene Bellew, who's an activist and one of the leaders of the investigation by the Williams Lake First Nation as she looks for answers and tries to hold the people who perpetrated these atrocities accountable. We follow the late Chief Rick Gilbert, who has a very haunting origin story of his own that cuts to his very DNA and includes multiple generations of his family and what they endured at the school as he sort of rises to speak that truth publicly for the first time. And then we follow my dad, myself, and my family as we reckon with the intergenerational impacts of St. Joseph's Mission and search for answers at the same time as we look for love and healing against a system that was designed to, tear us apart.
The film asks the question, what happens when the ghosts come home, or what happens when the ancestors come back to tell the story? And it grapples with faith. It grapples with spirituality. It grapples with an idea that Julian often talks about, which is what is post-apocalyptic life for Indigenous people, the apocalypse being colonization. And so how do we visually create the fabric of a story that both follows these characters and their emotional journeys and focuses on the emotional truth as well as the hard fact, and also captures the feeling of a world that was destroyed and taken and that is being built back in the wake of this kind of reckoning and truth-seeking?
So, Julian, you took an approach with this that was very personal. You decided to take that approach, and that took some courage to do that. So I commend you for that and for your family. But why was that important to you? How did you arrive at actually making that decision? Because you're a storyteller, a filmmaker, and you could have made this story like a whole bunch of different ways. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to go there, but you did.
Yeah, in a lot of my writing, I appear as sort of not just the reporter, but also as a character in the story who's trying to figure out stuff so that I can figure out stuff in some instances for myself. But actually with this story, my own proximity to it was one of my greatest points of hesitancy for even working on this project in the first place. When Em called me to work on a documentary about Indian residential schools, a big part of the reason why I needed to take some time to think about whether I could even work on something about that subject was that I knew my family had a very intense connection to these schools. I didn't know exactly what the story was, but I knew that there was a story there. And I didn't know if I was ready to touch that, let alone touch that in a medium that I'd never, worked in before. I'd have done like on-camera stuff, but I'd never, directed any kind of film of any kind of length. So it took a while, really honestly, for me to come around to participating. The majority of the first year of production, our first year in the field, we filmed almost nothing from my narrative. That's not to say, though, that like other people weren't already kind of pulling me into the story. So one of the scenes that you'll see in the film comes pretty early on in the narrative, and it's when my auntie Charlene Bellew brings me up to one of the barns at the mission. So the mission had a ranch that was actually arguably its main purpose was as a ranch, and then it was also arguably educating kids and using them as child labor as like a secondary thing. But the main point here is that Charlene brought me to the barns and she performed this ceremony, and she asks me to help her, tell this story. And on the day that happened, Charlene texted Em and said, bring Julian to the barns and bring your cameras. You're going to want to film this. And that's all she said. She didn't say anything about what she was about to do. And so it was very clear from early on that, she understood and saw that I was going to be part of this story in some way, shape, or form. But after that moment, I started to learn and understand a little bit more about what my dad's origin story was, the story of his birth and what happened at St. Joseph's Mission. I moved in with him for 2 years during the making of the documentary. I didn't live with him as a little kid growing up, so this is the first time I really spent a lot of time living with my dad since I was a very small child. It became clear that he was both really scared of the story and also really wanted answers. And as the time went on, it became clear that the wanting answers piece of it was outweighing the fear of the story piece of it. And then also, I think in particular, it felt like the right way to tell this story when you happen to, be the son of someone who was born at the mission, at St. Joseph's Mission. It felt like the right way to go about doing that was to, be fully willing to step into telling that very difficult story, especially when, the survivors around us, especially people like the late Chief Rick Gilbert, who travels in the film to the Vatican to confront a representative of the Catholic order that abused 4 generations of his family with a truth that has, haunted and humiliated him for his entire life. To see an old man, an elder, take on that journey and that truth-telling so courageously, ultimately I felt that, if people like Rick were trusting us with their stories, and here I was with my own story that cut to the core of, what happened to the babies who were born at this residential school, I needed to be willing to go there to reciprocate their courage and their bravery. And it took a lot. There was a lot of people who supported me along the way, my team first and foremost, my family, Charlene and the surrounding community, and all of our sort of ceremonial and cultural practices were all super important to taking care of me and my family as we took that very challenging task on. And, even when I set out to do it, I didn't know if it would be a healing thing or a harmful thing. I wasn't sure. But I'm really grateful that it has been for my dad, for myself, for all of us. It has ultimately been a healing journey.
Yeah, it was really relatable. Like I think that as Indigenous people, we go down these pathways. Sometimes we don't want to know. We want to know, but we don't want to know. Mm-hmm. What happened, and once I realized that's what this was going to be about, I was leaning in at that point, and I think that a lot of that this film, when the audience has a chance to see it, it'll speak to Indigenous people everywhere that are on that journey of trying to heal in our own lives, and heal from stuff that we don't even know where it came from, and to go down that pathway. So I commend you and your family for taking that journey in that way, and honoring the courage of the elders too, to go on that journey. And as the filmmaker and a friend to Julian in this film, how was how is that to balance? We got to make this really good film. We got to tell this really good story, but also like he's personally like discovering new information in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the most important thing was that first, like, we built trust between each other and built a vision for what we wanted this film to be. And that looked like a lot of days after we'd been out filming all day long with one of the participants, whether we were on the river till 4 a.m. while they were dip netting for salmon or on a hunt or whatever. We'd get home and we were all living together, Jules, myself, and Chris Lamarca, who I shot the film with. And we just talk and start talking about, what this world was, what we wanted to say with the film, what the storylines were. And so over that first year, we just built kind of a shared mind and a shared vision for what the film would be. So when the time came for Jules to step into the role of a participant and to trust me to carry that through, we had already really built that trust. And then for me, it was this very strange thing because, and to be clear, I really wanted Jules to work on the film with me as like an artist and storyteller. I'd never expected that he was going to become part of the film. But when he made that choice, like, we were behind him 100%. And when we knew that, when I was in the barn in that moment and Charlene called on Julian to be a part of the story, it felt like as if the world broke open. I could feel something energetically happening. And it was so powerful. I knew that if he did choose at some point to become part of the story and follow his path, that it would be quite extraordinary. And so there were a lot of moments, where we were on the road with Julian and Ed, and it was amazing. We were having the best time. And then they would have this very difficult conversation. And I watched my friend, who I knew who had been carrying this weight for so much of his life, be able to confront his dad about this very real pain. And it was, I wanted to be there for him. And the best way I could do that was I was often the one shooting Julian almost exclusively, because I wanted to be close to him and just hold the space for him and have him know that, like, I've got his back. But we always would regroup and just, like, first and foremost, how is Julian doing, like, as a human being in this moment? And then, once he was able to move into different parts of the film, then he's kind of back to the director role. But he really had to be present in his life when we were doing his part of the story for it to be authentic and real to what was happening. Yeah, I mean, I know your work, and so I was watching the film, watching you on that balance, and I just found it to be really, really compelling, powerful way to tell the story, and really authentic, and it made me reflect. I mean, honestly, it made me reflect on how boarding schools impacted my own family and how boarding schools impact, families throughout Indian country, and especially that intergenerational relationship. And when your dad, I had to take a break whenever one of the conversations you were having with your dad, and it was when he was talking about this pain and why he didn't know where these tears were coming from and all this pain that he was going through throughout these years, and how that translated to your relationship with him. And I think that's it's something that we're dealing with on kitchen tables all throughout Indian country. We're dealing with that every day. So I appreciate that. Appreciate that approach. We'll take a short break and come right back.
I felt dirty as an Indian all my life in residential school.
Look at that. It's all names.
I've been trying to find out what happened at St. Joseph's Mission.
For decades, there were reports of children disappearing from this facility.
How did it happen?
It's not something that you want to open up, it just keeps on damaging.
And we need to continue to hold each other up.
Our people are going to stand up.
You do know what happened with me, right?
I want to know the whole story.
So in this in the film Sugarcane, as I was watching it, like the feelings of rage come up, like there's the emotional part that tugs at your heart, the parts of it that you can relate to, and then there's like, for me, there was like moments of rage that came out, and one of my questions for you is just how do you navigate that rage? Some people burn churches down. Mm-hmm. Some people go to ceremony, and some people do both and everything in between. But like, how do you navigate the rage of what happened to your family and to the people and to the story that you're telling here?
Well, I mean, there is footage in the film of a burning church. It's archival, so we didn't burn the church, but we did at one point discuss with my dad the possibility of him building a little mini church and burning it as part of his story. We obviously did not end up going with that, but he was open to and potentially interested in the idea. I think that my own way of thinking about these emotions and the emotional truth of the story, which I think is a really important part of any real work of narrative art, is not just the intellectual truth or the investigative truth. It's also the emotional truth of what it is to, live in the wake of these institutions, to live in communities and families that were deeply impacted, that were torn apart, that were very, very nearly ceased to exist because of the residential schools and boarding schools. And I think that was a big thing that we tried to privilege in this documentary. We both have journalistic backgrounds, and in journalism you can a little bit get at the interiority of your characters, that sort of stuff, but it often comes with a little bit more of like an arm's length approach to the story, and you definitely can't get under the skin of something like you can in a feature film. So for myself personally, I not just even when we were filming, but also when we're out sharing this documentary with people, especially with Indian country, I try to be really emotionally present in what I'm feeling about the film, about this period of life for myself and my family and for all of our people, because I think that the appropriate and authentic way to share and tell a story like this is to, be fully in it, including especially, fully in it with your heart. And I find that, rather than, denying how I feel about things, I feel that I find that when I really allow myself to feel something, to be really upset about something, to be angry, to feel rage, to feel the pain of something, that allowing myself to have that feeling gives me the opportunity to move through it and to process it, rather than when I find myself denying my emotional state and my emotional truth. I think that's actually more when I run into problems with all this stuff.
Yeah.
This is a system that removed children from their families for over 4 generations in order to take the land and to disempower an entire community, systematically abuse the children, cut them off from language, culture, family, not allow them to be children, not allow parents to parent, and, a spiritual colonization as well by the schools that were run by churches. And we know that there were 139 of these federally funded schools in Canada. We know that there were 417 of these federally funded schools here in the United States, and yet it's barely been talked about or taught in history classes. And I think that we hope the film allows folks to be enraged or be upset or whatever it is that it brings them, but move people from a place of maybe shame or silence to a place of owning the narrative and taking the truth and offering the truth to folks to harness it and use it for however they want to, whatever agency that telling the story can give people, that can be a catalyst for real change. And there's a bill heading to the Senate that would start a truth commission here in the United States. And if this film in any way can help with that conversation and empower folks to call for that bill to go through and for there to be a reckoning here, then I think we would feel, that the film has really served the community.
Absolutely. This podcast, this show is called LANDBACK for the People. It's a show about land back. So some people might be thinking, well, what does the story of residential schools have to do with the land back movement? What's the relationship between residential schools, the stealing of Indigenous people's land, and land back? So I have that question, and part of that is also you personally, Julian, about what does land back mean to you?
Mm-hmm. The purpose of Indian residential schools and Native American boarding schools was to separate Native children from our familial and cultural contexts, our community contexts, and to fundamentally break down the structures that made us who we are, right? And that was a further part of the process of alienating us and separating us from the land that colonial states like Canada and the United States wanted to access so that they could extract wealth from it. And if you have a bunch of practices within your community and your family that require you to be out physically on the land at certain parts of the year for ceremonies, to hunt, to gather, to fish, when you have schools that are physically taking children out of their community, and in some instances taking them very far away from their community elsewhere, where they are being instructed in another religion, when they are at St. Joseph's Mission being used as ranch hands essentially and farm labor, then you are going to see cultures get disconnected from their territory. And as Indigenous peoples, we fundamentally, the way in which we live, the way in which we feed ourselves, the way in which we organize our ceremonies, the way in which we govern ourselves, it's all tied to the places that we come from. And so the residential schools, the Native American boarding schools as well, were really fundamental to breaking down all of those things. And they also, I think, were purposefully designed to create chaos within our families. You had generations of children who were taken away to these institutions where they suffered physical, psychological, sexual abuse, where some even died. And, that created ripple effects across generations that we're still seeing in our families. The duality of life one of the dualities of life as an Indigenous person is the fact that we have these big, families where we spend meaningful time with each other. And I think that we also can all relate to the fact that so many of our families are struggling. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of dysfunction in those very same family structures. And if you trace back the history of why that is, one of the leading causes for our grandparents' generation, our parents' generation, the generations before that, is the residential schools, is the Native American boarding schools. And so, I think that what does that history of colonization, tell us? I think that it tells us that, one of the most important things that we can and are doing as Indigenous peoples is to get back to our culture, is to get back our land, because these are the things that made us healthy. They made us who we are. And, I think right now, one of the most heartening things that I see when I visit Indigenous communities all across Canada and the United States is I see, new generations, my generation, the younger generation, the generation above me, really trying to reclaim so many of these things. My Ke'a, for example, that's my grandmother. She's a survivor of St. Joseph's Mission. She, suffers with so many different things from that institution, a lot of which she still can't even talk about. And yet, since the 80s, she's been a teacher of our language, a language that now has less than 100 remaining fluent speakers, and she's one of them. And she has taught that language to me. She's taught it to some of my cousins. She's training new teachers in our community. And I think that there are so many other examples of that. I think just back over the last 5 to 10 years at my own generation of of cousins, and there are so many more cousins than there were 10 years ago who now know some of our songs, who now play Lahal, our traditional gambling game, who are growing out their hair and taking a lot more pride in our culture and who we are. And I think that story is playing out all across Indian country, all across Canada, all across the United States. And it's also, happening at the same time as our people are reclaiming some of our power, are getting back, some of our land. There's obviously a really long way for us to go until we get back to where our ancestors, were. But I think that I see us as a people moving in that direction, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think of it as a continuum, land back. We put those two words together in this generation, but really, our people have been fighting for our land back ever since it was taken. Our people are fighting for what was taken from our people, our familial structures, our life ways, ever since it was taken, and we're always on this continuum. We're on this continuum of resistance, but also of shaping what the future looks like for us too. And I'm always balancing illuminating the past, both the beautiful things from our past and the beautiful culture of our past, and also the struggle. But how can we put both of those things together to catalyze our people forward? And that brings me to this question about why is this story so important for it to be told right now at this moment in history that we're in, 2024?
A lot of reasons. I would start with the fact that this isn't a story about the past, it's a story about the present. There are Native communities are suffering from rates of overdose and suicide at higher rates than any other communities in North America, and there's very clear reason for that. And in order to understand how to empower and give power back to the communities, you have to at the very least know the truth of what happened. And that truth has been kept from communities by the church, by the government. The records have not even been opened at this point. Very few of them have. But, we were living in a community to which Julian would often say, this is a community living on the edge of death. Well, what does that look like? It looks like Jules attended 10 funerals during the making of this film, and I attended several myself. It looks like folks who are way too young to be gone, leaving behind a lot of young children and orphans. And those folks were directly impacted by the schools. Their parents went there. They were abused by someone who was abused at the schools. These impacts that ripple out throughout Indigenous communities are so urgent. And until we reckon with what really happened and why and how we've gotten here, it's very difficult to move forward. I think it's also a moment where, because Canada has started a conversation about this, there's a real opportunity in the United States to move this conversation forward and move the needle forward on what Indigenous peoples want and decide as a collective to do with this information and what they want back from it. And some of that might be in a kind of Western sort of justice, or it might not be. And that's up to the communities to decide. But there couldn't be a more important time for this story to be coming to light and for folks to be able to reckon within their own families. It's an excavation of truth, not just of what's below the ground, but in the lives of families, to be able to rebuild and reclaim what was so brutally taken away.
Yeah, we've been having this conversation a lot here, even in the Chisapa and amongst Lakota territory, because of the battle of what's happening at Wounded Knee. I grew up 3.5 miles from Wounded Knee in Porcupine, from the massacre site. I remember as a kid when it still said the Battle of Wounded Knee on the historical marker, and now there's a thing over it that says massacre, and there's still this battle over the narrative about what happened there. I mean, literally, while all this healing work is happening, Secretary Haaland is having to meet with, the Department of Defense to talk about what actually happened there. And I think that when we think about history, it often seems like those who have been holding on to the ability to tell the history don't think that the next generation can digest it. And I think like the total opposite. We've been having these conversations a lot because we're here in the Black Hills, right? There's Mount Rushmore right here, and it's a huge conversation starter about the story of this country. And I keep telling them, I said, because a huge part of the economy here is tourism. It's the number one driver of the economy in South Dakota. And the number 3 reasons why people come to South Dakota, according to the South Dakota Department of Tourism, number 1 is Mount Rushmore. Number 2 is to hike, fish, and camp in the Black Hills. And number 3 is to learn something about Native Americans. Those are the top 3 things. Yet we're telling this completely historically inaccurate and wrong history here. And because they're dead set on perpetuating this colonial narrative, and they also don't think that people can digest it. As storytellers, what do you say to that?
Well, I think that part of what's been really interesting about having this film, right? Because we're here in the United States, the film is based in Canada, is the way in which it's like this funhouse mirror for both colonial, societies. In the U.S., this story about Canadian Indian residential schools has been this weird opportunity for American liberals to go like, oh my God, look at what Canada did. And, of course, Native people in the U.S. are like, what the fuck, man? The same thing happened here. In fact, the Indian residential schools in Canada are based off the schools in the United States. And there were 3 times as many schools here and many hundreds of thousands of more children that were taken away to those institutions. And we're just starting to figure out how many schools there even were federally funded in this country and what exactly happened at those institutions. So there's a conversation that needs to happen in this country that is way behind what's been happening in Canada for 15 years. And it's been really encouraging to see our film be picked up in the U.S. as part of that conversation. Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland came to our world premiere. She's, of course, leading the federal inquiry into Native American boarding schools. There's the bill that Emily mentioned to create a Truth and Healing Commission because, it's really essential that at the very basic level, this country has a real record of what happened at these institutions, because this is a foundational story of North America. At the same time, our film up in Canada is arriving in a moment, I would say, of fatigue about this story. Canada has been talking about residential schools as part of this truth and healing process for about 15 years. It's been now 3 years since the discovery of potential unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And it seems to us that a lot of the Canadian cultural leaders and institutions, the people who decide what the story of the day is, are kind of over the residential school thing. Until very recently, the Liberal government in Canada was not going to continue funding searches by First Nations. That has since changed in the last couple months. But it felt like and feels like Canada really wants to figure out a way to move beyond this story. They really want to get to the reconciliation part of the agenda because it turns out that the truth is just a little bit too hard. It's our hope that, bringing this film to communities like this one here in Rapid City, to Alaska, and around Indian country in the U.S. and Canada can help, continue to put momentum behind the essential part of this work, which is at the very most basic level to get the truth out there and known.
I think, as Joel said, narrative change is so important, and art can do that, and journalism can do that. It's been such an interesting experience for me here in South Dakota. I watched, Lakota Nation versus the United States, and it was so profound that because there was resistance from the Lakota people, they were some of the first children to be taken to a boarding school to disempower the people and be able to take the land. Like they went to the people who were resisting the most and started there. And what does that tell you, right? And I learned a lot about the Black Hills and how that was, promised in a treaty in 1868, I believe. And then 2 years later, gold was found, and so that went out the window. And then, of course, they carved the face of the folks who colonized the people here onto the side of their sacred mountain. And not only that, the guy who carved it had affiliations with the KKK, and he also built the monument in Georgia for the Confederate monument in Georgia, and read a whole article about his many kind of racist and white supremacist ideas. And I drove to Mount Rushmore and I sat at the back of a tour to hear what they were saying and how they were presenting the history. And of course, none of that is included, nothing at all. It starts at how amazing that this artist came here to carve these leaders of America. And I'm like, well, I think at the very least, people should be able to know the truth and make up their own minds about how they feel about it. It's not, our job as storytellers to say this is how you should feel, but it is our job to show you what it was and how it felt to other people. And then you get to decide as a human being, what you want to make of that. But I think that in order to move forward as a country, you have to start with the truth. And I think narrative change and art can really help with that.
Yeah, I got the opportunity I was down in Montgomery, and I got to meet Brian Stevenson down there in the Equal Justice Initiative, and I got to take tours of the National Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum.
Yeah, I've been there.
And the thing I really appreciated about that is it directly talks about the transatlantic slave trade, connects it directly to the era of lynching in Reconstruction, to the time period of the death of George Floyd and the uprising, and to mass incarceration. And it connects all of those things directly together. And I got to see Brian Stevenson, who was the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative that helped catalyze that narrative museum to become. And what he talks about is we have a duty, to tell these stories, because if we don't tell them, history is going to repeat itself. And has. And history around the world, other places, people have begun to tell these stories, and he was talking about going to Germany. He was talking about places that were impacted by the Holocaust. And he talks about, he went to some of these places and it blew his mind because they openly, everybody talks about it in society. There's museums, there's plaques, there's all these things everywhere you go that tell the story. And he's like, the United States does not do that. Like the colonial countries of North America they're not even close to getting to where we're, telling those stories. And now we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism. And we're seeing like the fact that history is already beginning to repeat itself. And I guess one of my last questions here as we begin to wrap it up is like, where do we go from here? This is an important story to be told. It's an important moment in history. Like, where do we go from here? What's your hope?
I think that part of what's so remarkable about the Indian residential school and Native American boarding school experience is that, as First Peoples across North America, we are remarkably diverse. There are over 570 federally recognized tribes here in the United States. There's over 600 First Nations recognized by the federal government in Canada. We speak dozens of languages. We come in all sizes, shapes, and forms. We're short and round. We're tall and skinny. We're light-skinned. We're dark-skinned. Some of us are mixed, some of us are not. We are all across the spectrum as a people. And yet, one of the things that we share is this experience at the boarding schools, at the Indian residential schools. You know, you would be hard pressed to find a Native family anywhere in the country that has not been impacted by this. And we know that because we've started to bring this film all across North America. You know, we went to, you know, even in Martha's Vineyard, you go visit the Aquinnah-Wampanoag, and there are people there who will say, you know, this is my uncle's story. My uncle was taken away to the Carlisle, you know, boarding school here and that's like as far away from British Columbia as you can get, and yet, you know, it's the same history, the same story. And so I think that, you know, part of the things that we struggle to do as Native people, because of that diversity and because we are very independent minded as people, is to sometimes to come together despite our differences. And I think that this is one part of our history that we really do all share, and that is bringing us together in a movement to make sure that the truth is known. And, you know, I think that that's been a really incredible part of this story up in Canada. We're starting to see that happen here in the United States in a big way. And I would give a lot of credit to Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland for the work that she's been doing in the administration that I wish would get more coverage, not just by the press, but also by, you know, Democrats in power as well. I think that, you know, that work is essential and deserves to be highlighted. And we really do hope that, like, everywhere this film goes, you know, it empowers, because at the same time, you know, every community, every school has its own story. And, you know, as our experience with Sugarcane and St. Joseph's Mission shows, there's still so much we do not know about these institutions. You know, our film uncovered a pattern of what happened to the babies at St. Joseph's Mission that we describe as an infanticide, right? And that was unreported until our film came out. And this is at an institution that there's been books written about St. Joseph's Mission. There were multiple criminal cases related to sexual abuse perpetrated by priests who worked at this school. Like, this was not a school that people did not know anything about. There was actually a record, and yet, despite that record, there were fundamental parts of the story of what happened at this institution that we did not know. And multiply that 138 more times across Canada, 417 times at least across the United States. And how many other stories are out there like this that we still need to know, that people have been holding in, that people survived, that deeply impacted them, that the rest of the country needs to know about, and there needs to be some accountability about. You know, I think that that's something that obviously gets me a little bit fired up about this work. And
rightfully so.
And we're really grateful to have the opportunity to do it. You know, we've been on this res tour. We visited Sitka, Alaska, and Anchorage, Alaska, which is ironic because there's only one res in all of Alaska, as they'll tell you, and it's Metlakatla. We didn't go to it. But you know, now we're here, of course, in the Dakotas, a place with its own really intense history and very proud people. We visited Standing Rock, which obviously, you know, big part in the story of Indian country writ large. I went to Eagle Butte, South Dakota, you know, home of a strong resisting people, and now we're here in Rapid City with you and Indian Collective, and you know, we're just so excited.
Are you scared of Pine Ridge or what? I wouldn't blame
the
you.
Wild Oglalas. No, we're not scared of Pine Ridge. You're not scary, Nick. We'd love to bring it to Pine Ridge eventually. And you know, it's been an honor to bring the film, you know, and everywhere we go, people start sharing their own stories and see so much of themselves in this film. And it's just been like the most important part of this work that was, you know, the part of it putting it out in the world.
So a couple housekeeping. Where can people watch the film? And also, this film was like, you know, picked up by, was it National Geographic?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were really lucky that the film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and won the directing award and has showed in many festivals since and garnered a lot of acclaim and feedback from there. And we got really lucky that National Geographic Documentary Films decided to distribute the film. And so what that means is that we will be streaming on Disney Plus, in Hulu, and so everyone will get an opportunity to see it. But as Jules mentioned, like, our most important mission here is to bring the film to the communities to whom it belongs, and to give people an opportunity to use it as a tool in whatever way feels right to each community, to open those conversations. And I think what's been so incredible is that we've seen, in the making of the film, we saw survivors like Rick be able to relieve themselves of this burden they had been carrying for so long. And we didn't know it would be Rick's last year of life when we filmed with him. And he has this kind of amazing scene in the film where he really speaks his truth. But he was able to move into the next life without that burden, and relieved in this extraordinary way. And I think the more we've shown it, the more people reach out to us and say, hey, I drove 2.5 hours here with my dad to see it. And on our way home, he was able to talk about the boarding schools for the first time. And that is the impact that is most meaningful to us, and that we're hoping moves the needle on this.
Absolutely. So is it the website? What's their website?
Sugarcanefilm.com.
People can find out more information at sugarcanefilm.com.
Or follow us at Sugarcane Film on Instagram.
One other question as we close out here, last question, is just if people want to support the work that's happening, particularly, north of the Medicine Line in so-called Canada, is there an organization you can point to if people want to contribute, if people want to support the pursuit of justice in this issue and the healing that people are seeking up there?
I think, one of the best things that people can do is start looking into what happened in their own, vicinities regionally, because these schools existed everywhere. And so as the searches in Canada are ongoing, those searches need to begin here in the United States. And so I'd say folks should look to their communities, and non-Indigenous folks should start learning about it. And I think there's a basic knowing that needs to happen as a baseline.
I think that we're in an interesting moment with this, in part because of what's happening with this movement, but also because both of the countries that ran these systems are actually in election years. Obviously, we take Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, a little bit to task in our own film, but his administration has been supporting federal funding for these investigations, which are themselves in Canada actually being led by First Nations, because the federal government and the law enforcement agencies have really kind of forfeited their ability to do so. And I think that that's another really important part of this is how do the people in power support, how do elected officials, the people in power, the federal government, how do they support or not support these efforts? And that ultimately is a really important deciding factor about how this work can move forward.
Well, I appreciate both of your work. I appreciate the film, and also just putting good luck on continuing to raise the awareness, in this medium, change the narrative, educate the public. And it's been an honor for you to be here in my homelands and have you on LANDBACK for the People. So come back again.
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely.